So this is an essay called Friend of My Heart, Courtship and Marriage in Early America from the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. And I'm sharing it with you because I think it really fits perfectly with what we've been discussing in the contrast. And what I really like about it is it gives us other primary texts, other artifacts from the period that we can look at together and apply back to the contrast. So I'm going to walk you through the document to sort of preview for you the artifacts that are in here and sort of make sure you understand the structure of it. After you watch this video, you're going to read the document. I encourage you to print it out and annotate it, but you can annotate it electronically if you have a good way of doing that. And then once you have watched my video and carefully read and annotated the document, then you're going to participate in a discussion where I ask you to take a primary artifact from this document and connect it to a passage of your choosing from the contrast and talk about the relationship between the two. Okay, so this document starts off with a painting from Charles Willson Peale. He's an artist we're going to hear a little bit more about from our friend Robert Hughes at various points. So this is an artifact. The painting itself is the artifact, and the language that accompanies it is a really good example, right, of a secondary source, a contemporary historian using language to explain to us the original artifact. So we have the primary source, the artifact is the painting, and we're later provided a citation for that. And then we have the secondary source, which is the language analyzing, explaining, contextualizing the painting. In our exercise, after we finish studying this essay, I'm going to ask you to take a primary artifact or text and connect it to the contrast. Not the secondary material, but the primary material. All right, and then we move on and we get an interesting example of a text, an artifact that is a primary text from the period. This is an example of a letter. And so we can work with this kind of artifact and compare and connect it to something we see in the contrast. So once again, this is the secondary material up here. The primary material, the primary artifact, appears down here. Okay. Now, sometimes it's kind of cool to look at what we call material culture. Instead of a formal painting, we look at something like, in this case, a teapot, or a piece of furniture, or a piece of clothing from the period, and talk about how this might connect. So here again, we have the primary artifact, which is the teapot, and then we have the secondary analysis that interprets the teapot. What I'm interested in you doing is seeing, could you talk about the relationship of this teapot to something from the contrast? Could it connect, for example, to ideas of domesticity and class in the contrast? Could we align it with Charlotte's sort of view of materialism in the contrast? The goal will ultimately be find a passage from the contrast and connect it in whatever way you want to this image of the teapot. All right, so far we've looked at 3 different artifacts. By the way, there's a citation down here for the artifact. Now we're going to another written artifact. Again, introductory language is the secondary source. The primary source is the quote from the time period. And that's right here. And so that would be interesting. How would you connect this quote to a quote from the contrast? It's interesting that words like virtue are connected here with words like liberty. So see what you could do with that and see where you might be able to connect it to something from the contrast. Our next artifact is another image. This is from Charles Willson Peale. And again, we've got the original artifact and the secondary language describing it. Could you connect this to some discussion in the contrast? A passage, perhaps, where the women are talking about their roles, or their clothes, or fashion in the culture, or class and status in the culture. Lots of possible connections. And again, we get a nice little citation here. We get another artistic image. This gets us to masculinity. This would be an interesting piece to maybe connect to something Manly says, or something that Maria says about Manly, or something that we want to contrast with Dimple. There's a lot of ways you could play with this artifact, and that's what I would like you to do in the discussion after you've read through this essay. A looking glass, another example of material culture. What could you do here with this mirror and some of the discussions that go on in the contrast about appearance and fashion and the emphasis on the material? And then we have a little excerpt from Thomas Jefferson. And again, this is the secondary material introducing the artifact, although it includes some quotes from the original artifact. And then here's the artifact itself. Another resource is a really interesting description of a fire that takes place in a Richmond theater. Now, this is significantly later than our text, but it still has some interesting possibilities if you want to connect it. I don't see this one as being as directly useful for us, but I think it gives us a sense of the dangers of theater in an all-wood world where you crowd a lot of people into a space. But I'm not sure that you'll want to use that for this project. And finally, there's a cool list of recommended reading where you could explore other ideas and material related to this larger essay. Okay, so that's what's going on in this little essay. You'll notice it's only about 8 pages, so it shouldn't take you much more than a half hour to 45 minutes to work through it. And I want you once again in the discussion after you've gone through it to take one of these artifacts and connect it to a passage from the contrast. Thanks. See you in Canvas.